John stalked through the green forest, a flintlock musket cradled in his arms. The frontier was dense and wet and stunk of red mud. The trees all about him whistled with wind. He had been a lawyer once, well, 6 months ago, but that felt like an eternity. 6 months of stumbling through Pennsylvania forests, living off berries that made him sick and fish that taste like mud. He thought back to the simple meals he'd make back home. They seemed quaint at the time, but he missed them dearly. Even the day of the trial, which had ostensibly been the worst of his life. At least he was well fed. Pushing through dense vegetation, he searched the ground for tracks, but he'd lost them. He retraced his steps and tried again. Tried to be the kind of tracker he wished he was. The type that could spot a single leaf out of place, that could spell prey and predator alike from a mile off. But in truth, he was not that kind of hunter. He hadn't even used his musket since he'd been out here. Hadn't had a chance. His mind returned to the scent of fresh pepper cake, to the taste of pickled eggs and jumble cookies, to the day of his last trial. His client, a 17-year-old boy who killed his father. The courts didn't agree it was self-defense, and he was hanged on the hill until dead. John gave up on the law and retired to the woods that night. The imagined scent of freshly baked goods was interrupted by the stench of rot, as John stumbled upon a septic pile of viscera, abandoned after the carcass it once belonged to had been butchered. It was surrounded on every side by boot tracks and hoof prints, presumably from the hunter and whatever beast the gore had come from. Though the prints were not from a deer, nor an elk. They looked far more like cow or goat tracks. John didn't think there were mountain goats in this part of the country, but was more so concerned that the area had been hunted out by a fellow frontiersman, or worse, a native. He was worried the tracks he'd been following for nearly a day and a half belonged to a long-dead doe. He tried not to dwell on this thought. He'd done nothing but fish for 3 nights straight, which was enough for a lifetime as far as he was concerned. More trouble than they're worth, he thought. All that sitting around just to wind up with a guppy not even the size of your hand. No, what he could really go for now was a nice slice of venison. And so he stalked the green forest and waited. It was maybe 2 hours later when his patience paid off. Perched atop a rounded hill, John peered down the sights of his musket and scanned the picturesque landscape before him. Vibrant, rolling hills were interrupted only by the freshwater spring that weaved between them. Fields of white flowers interspersed with algae-laden tree trunks, and a birchwood grove punctuated with a lone, white-tailed buck. 50 yards away and on the other side of the spring, John sat silent and unmoving. He didn't blink, his breath the only motion his body was permitted to make. And yet the buck refused to cooperate as it faced away from John's musket, a bad shot, and he was forced to wait till it showed its broadside. Maybe 15 minutes passed where neither man nor game moved more than an inch. Every moment, John grew worried the deer could dash off in an instant, and so he made a compromise within his own mind. He'd wait for the creature to turn, but if it were to take even a single step in any other direction, he would shoot it on sight. Maybe not kill it, but at least he'd have a blood trail to follow. It was a fair compromise, and may have even turned out, but it was never seen to fruition. You see, just as the lone white-tailed buck was John's unknowing prey, he was the prey to another. 12 feet off to the back left of his huddled body was a mountain lion. It peered through slit pupils as it sank backwards, bearing its weight on crouching haunches as it readied its pounce. And just as it did, John saw. Its ravenous fangs cut between the bones in his left forearm, which had snapped like dead wood with a sudden twist of its serrated jaw. John struck the feline's face with the heel of his offhand, but it was a weak blow, immediately countered as the beast slashed his shoulder with black claws, pushing him back into the ground as it pulled dangling flesh from his broken arm. John dug his heels in loose dirt as his feet kicked ferociously and managed to push both himself and the cat about 4 feet through the hillside terrain. He reached for fistfuls of fur, which did little but annoy as the beast made its way further down his arm, just below the shoulder, pulling tendons like loose string from a blanket. Only half his left hand remained on his body, the other half lay discarded in the grass. Further down the hill, his musket had been left to tumble. The white-tailed buck ran off long ago, lucky to live another day. As for John, it's not exactly clear, but at some point, with nearly just as much blood painting the scenic grassland as remained in his body, he fell unconscious. He awoke in the night. Not the next night, the one after. The whole hillside stunk of death as his spilt blood had been left to fester in a day and a half of hot, late summer sun. Everything hurt. Even his legs, which had been left untouched by the mauling, ached tremendously. Through a blend of blood loss, dehydration, and hunger, his whole body shimmered with pain. Moving his head felt like a crown of thorns, and the pain in his arm was almost unnotable, despite the fact that it was missing entirely. A tourniquet was tied just below the shoulder, and the once gaping wound was sewn shut. He tried to look down at the stump, but even his eyes seared when he moved them. Out of sight, someone approached from downhill. Their soft steps avoided the copious blood as they made their way toward John. "Who are you?" he asked, weakly. And though he did not understand the answer, it was the voice of a little girl. She sounded surprised. With that, her soft footsteps quickened until suddenly she was beside him, lowering the nozzle of the leather-bound canteen directly between his lips. He drank. The water was cold and sweet, but that hardly mattered. He would have drank even if it were boiled. He drank until the bottle ran dry and until the girl pulled it away. Next, she fed him berries and mushrooms. Again, they were delicious, but again, that didn't matter. His teeth gnashed so ferociously he bit her on the hand by accident. He was still hungry, even after she ran out of food, but it was enough for now. Exerted from the immeasurable task of eating from another's hand, he fell unconscious once again and didn't wake till around noon the next day. He felt horrible, but a lot better than before, even finding the strength to sit up and look about his surroundings. A cool breeze drifted past and cascaded down the hill. The little girl sat about 3 yards away, upwind, but was ready with another canteen full of fresh spring water and a bag of foraged berries. John ate and drank and found he was full as he'd been in a while. He turned his attention to his strange associate. "Who are you, anyway?" She was a young Lenape girl, but of course, John couldn't tell the difference between her tribe and any other. She was about 10 years old, maybe younger, with a simple leather dress. Her nose drifted to one side as if it had been broken and reset, and she had a deep, burgundy scar across the length of her forehead, just below the hairline. She smiled, but didn't answer his question. "You don't speak English, do you?" Again, there was no reply. "Well, I appreciate the help, I guess." John sat a moment longer, then rose, slowly to his feet, and made his way down to the hill. Seeing this, the girl grabbed her canteen and a wooden spear and followed him down. As he reached the bottom, John knelt beside the knee-high stream and fished about the water until he dredged his musket out from its surface. Waterlogged. The gunpowder in its barrel was beyond worthless, the flint had gone missing, and the firing pin was bent. Even if it had survived its 2 days in the stream, he'd have a hell of a time aiming it with not but the one arm. He placed it gently on the bank, then stood. The girl, meanwhile, readied her spear and leapt to a large stone in the middle of the spring. From there, she hopped to a second, then a third, holding the spear across her shoulders like an acrobat crossing the tightrope. Hopping from one stone to the next, she eventually reached as far as she could, then knelt down and stared intently at the crystalline water. She held her spear against her right shoulder, with the end jutting toward the sky and the point down toward the stream. John slowly caught up with her and sat crisscrossed on the bank. The two of them sat in silence for some time, with the whistling wind and babbling stream the only sound in miles. The tiny, hand-sized mudfish John had periodically eaten for months on end swam through the clear water. The girl ignored them. "Do you have a name?" John asked, not expecting an answer, but finding the silence unbearable. "My name is Johnathan Henry Smudge. You can call me John." The girl glanced briefly, but her focus on the water's surface remained unbroken. John pounded his chest as he spoke each syllable. "Me, John, Smudge." The girl glanced again, smiling as she sat up and copied his gesture. "Me, John, Smudge." Her voice was as deep as she could manage. John laughed as he leaned back on his palm. "Well, not quite, but we're getting closer, I guess." Still smiling, the girl turned her attention back to the water, and an unbearable silence returned to the vibrant valley. "Where's your family? Did they abandon you, or are you some kind of runaway?" Even if she could, John wouldn't have expected an answer. "Well, I guess that's why I'm here now. My father was a farmer and my brother a mason, so I always wanted to do, I don't know, something like that. My father said I was unfit. Since I'm left-handed, he said I should go into academics, which I did, but, well, anyway, I guess that's why I'm here now." He knew the girl couldn't understand, and yet he still felt embarrassed for sharing. He allowed silence to return to the valley. Later, after 2 hours spent kneeling on a drifting stone, the girl rose triumphant to her feet, spear poised in the air, and flung it nearly 3 yards downstream. It stuck in the gravel below. She leapt from her stone and dashed through the stream, retrieving her spear and lifting it valiantly above her head, a flopping 5-pound trout impaled at its point. "Namès!" she yelled, shaking the bloody fish. Shortly thereafter, John tried to make a fire, but found he was unable. The girl volunteered to do it for him and even held her arm behind her back to show how he may be able to do it in the future. They roasted thick trout fillets above the licking inferno and traded stories in their native tongues. John spoke of his home in Philadelphia as the girl weaved grandiose and far-fetched tales of her time on the salmon runs. Of course, neither could understand the other, but they listened intently nonetheless. When John finished his final story, a simple tale of a Mrs. Cheesemonger who'd been his fiancée for some time, he felt as homesick as he had in March. In a sudden silent spell, he glanced down at his stub, then back across the flames toward the girl. "I'm not suited for life out here no more. Well, not that anyway. I reckon I'll head back toward Philly. But then I guess there's a question to do with you. Quakers don't have Indian schools, and I can't, in good conscience, let you be a Catholic. Of course, you could just stay out here, but if you decide to stick with me, I'm not sure how I'd convince you not to." The girl sensed the shift from lighthearted story towards serious discussion and listened carefully with her chin resting in her palms. "So I guess you'll stay savage, at least for now, till we can maybe teach you a little English. And by then, I reckon you'll have a pretty good idea if you want to stay in Philly or return to the wood. So how's that sound?" John woke the next morning to phantom pain. It started as a non-existent itch on his missing forearm, then grew steadily to a searing ache. He flexed his loose tendons in hope of a remedy, but to no avail. After an hour of restless toiling, he rose and took a walk, massaging the stump. As he made his way back down to the stream, he cupped water with the palm of his hand and drank. It was just as cold as it had always been, and nearly just as sweet, but now there was the faintest taste of sulfur. He shook his hand to dry it. On his way back to their smoldering fire, he found something, half buried in the dirt. He yanked it from the soil and brushed it off as best he could. It was a human jawbone, half of one anyway, split straight down the middle with a clean cut, made, no doubt, by a sharp blade. He heard a bell ringing softly in the distance. The jaw was weathered and brittle, dry as the dust of Sinai, and had probably been there for years, but John took it as reason enough to leave that scenic valley and make his way back home. The girl followed him every step of the way. 5 days later, an Appalachian cottontail sat silently in the underbrush. The girl had found him and pointed it out to John, who held the wooden spear above his head. He pushed it back, then flung it forward. In an instant, it flew through the air, in a perfect arc, and stuck flawlessly in the forest floor, 2 feet away from the rabbit. It spooked and ran off, but the throw showed great promise, considering everything he knew had been learned in a little less than a week. The girl tracked the rabbit and killed it herself, but did her best to commend John's effort. They hunted rabbits for miles on end as they approached Philadelphia, catching 3 or 4 a day. Once they got 6, 2 by John's own hand, and while he was still a lousy shot, he eventually filled the role of terrier, wandering through the brush and spotting cottontails that the girl could quickly dispatch of herself. 2 weeks went by like this, but one day, as John stalked the green forest, he found a large black shape, waiting in the distance, maybe 50 yards away. It stood nearly motionless, its black head indistinguishable from its black body or legs, its yellow eyes and white horns the only distinguishable features. John motioned for the girl to follow but not to attack, and the 2 of them inched closer. The shape didn't startle. Now 10 yards away, John's view was much more clear. It was a goat. A black goat with a golden bell affixed around its neck, like the collar of a cat. John got as close as 5 yards away before it even seemed to notice them. It turned and walked away, slowly, looking back as if asking them to follow. They did. For a quarter mile, they followed the domestic beast as they approached whatever destination it had in mind. John spotted thick plumes of smoke hardly visible through the forest canopy. Natives wouldn't make a bonfire this close to the city, so surely the smoke belonged to a fellow frontiersman. As the goat, John, and the girl pushed past the Pennsylvania foliage and into a brief clearing, they found a simple cottage. A humble little cabin with cracked, single-pane windows and a red brick chimney. But that's not where the smoke had come from. 5 yards before the cottage was a burning pile of dead pigs, maybe 50 head. They'd been gutted and butchered, their empty skins left to burn, filled with hay and dark hair to act as kindling. The whole clearing smelled of death and rot and sulfur. Seemingly excited, the black goat trotted toward the cabin, just as the front door swung open. Inside was a motionless man with pale skin and a blue face. He wore the tattered overcoat of a naval captain, and nothing else. His long hair was just as black as the goat, maybe blacker. His teeth were blacker still. The girl's nostrils flared in discomfort as she stood behind John, but John was more curious than concerned. The pale man spoke without moving. "You've lost your way, haven't you, boy?" "Well, no, sir, not really. I'm well on my way back home." "And where is home?" "Back in Philly." "Sir?" "And what life awaits you back in Philly? The life of a cripple not worth his weight in mason stones?" The girl wrapped her arms around John's leg as she hid her face from the pale man. For the first time, its eyes broke contact with John's as it glanced down and looked at her. "She doesn't understand us, does she?" "Who?" John asked, but the man refused to answer. John continued as if he had. "No, she can't." "Do you know what you are, boy? A failure. 3 times over. To your household, to your city, and now to your nation if you'd allow yourself to bring a babbling savage back to the civilized world." Smoldering pigs squealed as though still alive. "But you don't have to be a failure. You can free yourself from this burden. And I'll make it worth your while, too." "How?" "Your arm. I'll give you your arm. For the girl." He grew tumescent with anticipation. The next 3 days were made up of uneasy travel across harsh terrain. It stormed for 2 days straight. But at long last, after nearly 7 months in the wood, Johnathan Henry Smudge smelled Philly in the air. And as he re-entered his old home, more nervous now than he'd been when he left, he rubbed his hands together.